Here at the Gunnison Bend of the Sevier River, just south of Delta, Utah, the most infamous massacre of the Walker War took place on October 26, 1853. So basically, Gunnison was a West Point graduate. He was a very smart man, and he was a well-known veteran. In fact, he had served in the Seminole Wars and had taken up a job as a mapper for the Army in Florida before he was moved out west. And sometime around mid-1853, he was tasked with moving up the Gunnison River, following the Green River, and then making his way out to the Sevier River here in Utah. And it was a mission from the Central Pacific Railroad. They wanted to find out if it would be possible to move their rail right through the center of Utah. And right here on the banks of this dried up river on October 26, 1853, the most brutal massacre of the Walker War took place, and it saw the death of influential Army Captain John William Gunnison and 7 of his men, killed and buried on the banks of this river. And when he arrived here, they told him in Manti and they told him in Nephi, there's a war going on, and Chief Walkara is attacking vulnerable people. And immediately he brushed it off because he'd been up in the Pacific Northwest and he'd negotiated with the hostile Salish tribes. So basically he said, you know, if I can negotiate with these warrior tribes of the Pacific Northwest, Chief Walkara is of no consequence to me. And he comes out here, and sure enough, as it progresses on through the year and it gets to be bitter cold, it's October, Gunnison is nearing Lake Sevier, and he wants to hurry up and make it back to camp because there's snow flurries. And he says, me and 11 men will go south along the Sevier River, and the rest of the party can go up north. Well, just as he entered these tall reeds, they're surrounded on all sides by open desert in a great basin. But these are the tall reeds, and he's moving through these, and it's not very clearly visible who might be moving through the reeds. And he and his party were surrounded, ambushed, and massacred by Pavant. Basically, we don't know if these Pavant were under the direct command of Chief Walkara, but at the same time, there was a general warfare happening in the Great Basin, and Walkara was very friendly with the Pavant. They called them the Pede back at the time. And 7 of his men and Gunnison himself were killed, and the rest ran up the river and signaled the rest of the party, which was just north, to come and rescue them. Sadly, nobody could be rescued, and Gunnison met his end here on the Gunnison Bend of the Sevier River. And I'm here again at Gunnison Bend, where the massacre actually took place, to talk about the principle of retribution. Basically, this principle was 3 ways to avoid conflict, and it was practiced all throughout the Great Basin. If I killed somebody in a neighboring tribe, they have every right to ask for me to kill, and that would avoid a tribal war. And then if my tribe can't find me to turn me over, they have a right to ask for a family member that's commensurate with the crime I've committed. You know, if it was an accident, they could ask for my sick and dying grandmother, and if it was intentional, they could ask for my brother. And then if both of those options fail, they have a right to ask for goods and services: horses, cattle, guns, ammo, food, anything really. But if none of these 3 options pan out, then a war results. And the specific incident which I'm referring to here is months before Gunnison and his party were massacred, there was an Indian massacre that happened at the mouth of Manti Canyon. Walker's men tried to do a raid on the town, and after they were repulsed, they had to make off with 2 stolen oxen. And a local Mormon militia found 11 of them at the mouth of Manti Canyon trying to slaughter these animals, and they were themselves slaughtered. All 11 of the Native Americans were killed by the local Mormon militia. So months later, when they see Gunnison and his party moving down the river, they see 11 people, which matches the number killed in Manti, and they say this is perfect for the principle of retribution, we will just massacre them. And if the Mormon settlers understood the principle of retribution, this could have been averted much earlier by offering them gifts at the death of Walker's brother. Now, of course, this didn't pan out because both parties were very prideful, and a war resulted. Before detailing the Walker War, you need to understand the political and cultural shifts that were taking place here in the Great Basin in the decades leading up to it. Basically, in 1776, the Dominguez Escalante expedition came up over the Uinta Mountains and passed down south of the Great Salt Lake, where they met with Turanchichi, Walkara's grandfather, at Dominguez Hill. And there they made a proposition to him: convert to Christianity, and also we see that you practice a form of slavery slavery, where you take all of these kind of nomadic tribes and you use them for subsistence labor. Well, Dominguez and Escalante said, we're going to make a Spanish trading route just south of Utah Territory, the Santa Fe Trail. Why don't you send some of those slaves our way? We'll give you rifles and ammunition, and you'll be able to rule over the Great Basin with an iron fist. Now, he did, but this greatly fractured their society because they weren't used to these European weapons. So by the time Turanchichi died, Walkara's father, a man named Munch, was in control of much of the Great Basin, and he made sure that his sons were chiefs. So Munch, because he had all these weapons, was often sought out to go wage war against rival tribes. And he was approached by the Timpanogos who said, why don't you go wage war against the Snake River Indians up in Idaho? And Munch said, absolutely not. So one of the rebels in the Timpanogos approached him from behind at a campfire and shot him in the back, killing him instantly. And this caused a huge power struggle in the Great Basin, and 6 of his sons rose to prominence. Walkara was not a chief at this point, but he stayed a spiritual advisor. And shortly after his father died, he began having visions. And in one of these visions, he died of an illness for 2 days, and he went to the Happy Hunting Grounds. And in the Happy Hunting Grounds, he was shown white people coming here to Utah, and he said that the angels told him it would be in 1847. Now, a lot of early storytellers said that he correctly predicted the first white people to arrive, but in reality, there were already white people living in the valley. I mean, his brother, Petit Neat, his sister, was actually married to a Rocky Mountain wild man who was living in a cabin just north. And this is kind of, they knew that white people were coming, and Walkara was told to make peace with them by the angels that visited him. But when they finally did make it down to the same place, Dominguez Hill, to talk to him, he realized that he wanted to fight back. So these early meetings in 1847, the same year that they arrived, he accused his brother of being weak and not fighting them. And he was ousted for a period of time before he finally came back and he saw the agriculture that the Mormons had brought, and he decided to embrace them and invited them to live in his lands down near Sandpitch County. And this is kind of where the war kicks off, because naturally when you have Indians living right next to white settlers, things begin to go south very, very quickly. Next to me is the grave of the pioneer James Russell Ivey, who sort of unintentionally began the Walker War. And as the story goes, there were tensions that were heating up with the tribe. Naturally, you had disease, lack of resources, overhunting on the part of the Mormons, and people were dying off. In June, there was an incident at which Walkara, between this time and June, had moved his people to 80 lodges north on the river. And he was going to just live peacefully, but the price of flour had gone up. So a local woman went into James Ivey's cabin about 1.5 miles north of town and traded 3 fish for 3 cups of flour. Now, her husband caught wind of this, so the husband walks into James Ivey's cabin with the woman and begins beating her savagely. She's on the ground, he's kicking her, and James Ivey tries to step in and stop the fight, but another man walks in and tries fighting James Ivey. So Ivey goes to beat one of the Indians, where the guy grabs a gun, but Ivey gets it first, and the gun breaks in 2, and Ivey shoots the guy and bashes him over the head with the gun. And then another 2 Native Americans come in, and Ivey knocks them both out. So by the time one of them wakes up, only one man dies, but one wakes up, they all go back to the village, and they tell Walkara that your brother has died, because unfortunately James Ivey had, unbeknownst to him, killed Walkara's brother. Now it was serious. So Walkara came into town and said, we demand James Ivey. Avert this war, give us Ivey, and we'll call it even. But the town had already created a little militia because things were already heating up, and they knew this meant war. And you can see here that James Russell Ivey was killed by Indians in the Black Hawk War. Black Hawk was actually a relative of Walkara, and basically as soon as the Black Hawk War was declared, a lot of people who were initially killed were killed because of their involvement in the Walker War years prior. So I'm positive that Russell was very much targeted. They had a vested interest in, almost as soon as the war broke out, making sure to go and kill him. Ivey shot and killed, or mortally wounded, Walkara's brother about 1 mile north of the town of Springville at Spring Creek. There was a camp there of 80 Indian tents, and as soon as his brother had been wounded, Walkara comes down, retrieves his dying brother, and brings him up to Basin Canyon, and they rendezvous with Chief Aropine, Walkara's brother, and Aropine comes back into town, and tries to meet with Bishop Aaron Johnson, who's a local figure in the community. He really ties it together, and he's considered a friend of the Indians. So Aropine has dinner with him. It's a very large meal, and you know, they think that there's peace, and as Aropine leaves on a good note, somebody snipes, one of the local Indians snipes a member on the fort. And because the sun had just set, a lot of people said Aropine made peace and then turned back and killed this guard at the fort. Now there's no evidence, and Aropine never said that he did. In fact, the tribe said that it was kind of a local renegade who took matters into his own hands, but the situation had rapidly escalated into open conflict. A couple of other measures were taken to try to reach peace, but by this point, all of Walkara's brothers wanted war, and in fact, Walkara died very shortly after the end of the war, so we don't have his opinions on the matter, but a lot of people at the time said Walkara did not himself want war. It was his brothers who wanted it at the death of one of their own siblings. So Walkara was kind of the figurehead of it because he was the man who retrieved the body, the man who rallied a lot of troops. He was a spiritual leader, but in reality, they all came up into this canyon and they started amassing all the families, and they went up to Bald Mountain, which is where the families camped. And that was their initial base of operations, but later they fanned out into the mountains and began launching raids across the Salt Lake City Basin and the Salt Lake Valley. And the war would go on for several months until they saw the Gunnison Massacre, the massacre at Fountain Green, and a couple of other killings, especially of people that had already made a bad name for themselves amongst the Native Americans. Thomas Clark was discovered when Isaac Morley found the bodies of him and his 3 compatriots who had been killed by Indians on October 1st, 1853 in the Walker War. And because they hadn't followed Morley's directions, Morley was furious and he just buried them in a local cliff. Well, he didn't want them to ever have a marked grave, but when the news was found, they brought it back up to Manti, and one of his relatives, George Peacock, who was a lieutenant colonel, kind of high-ranking in the territorial militia, it said that he went back and actually went through the effort of getting Thomas Clark a decent burial. And the gravestone of Thomas Clark is actually right here behind me. It's kind of decaying. And just behind the grave of Thomas Clark, who died in the Fountain Green Massacre, is the grave of one of the men who died alongside him, William Luke. Although Luke himself is not actually buried here, he's probably buried somewhere near Fountain Green. Because again, Isaac Morley was so upset that these 4 men didn't follow his directions that he kind of demanded they just be buried anonymously out in the canyon. And as George Peacock and the advance party, they continued up the canyon to what's now Nephi, and they found an Indian camp. And 8 Indians there were wiped out. They figured, well, these are the closest Indians and they might have been involved, so we're going to wipe them out. Their graves were found as recently as 2005, and the last I checked, there was kind of a battle with the tribe over what to do with those bodies. An incredibly overlooked facet of the Walker War is the interaction with early Mormon settlers and Indians with the local mountain men up at Fort Bridger. And as soon as the Walker War kicked off, the Mormon leadership forbade any kind of trading with the Native Americans, especially in ammunition and alcohol. But the men up at Fort Bridger were still engaged with this trade, and they viewed it as their right because they'd been there since the 1820s. They found that Jim Bridger and Vasquez had already run off into the hills, but they killed quite a few mountain men at the fort. They broke up his whiskey still, and they chased the rest of them over to Green River and killed anybody who didn't immediately surrender. They brought up Wild Bill Hickman, who acted as a sort of local official, and they put a stop to trading with the Indians. And remember, this fort was kind of in an Indian middle ground zone where the Shoshone and the Ute and the Cheyenne, they would all meet together and trade. So one of the mountain men, who was later in the hills, he would come down and talk to the Mormon leadership, was Elijah Barney Ward, and he's actually mentioned in Wild Bill Hickman's book as a very fascinating person. And once he befriended Hickman and converted to Mormonism, the rest of the mountain men kind of joined in their fight against the Indians. So, because he had built up that reputation for himself, they saw him as somebody who had turned their backs on the Native Americans. He was the first death in the Black Hawk War years later. And you can see here the grave of William Shepard Baxter right next to the grave of the mountain man Elijah Ward, who was the first person killed, right alongside his friend James Anderson as the war kicked off. And you can tell that these were some targeted killings. They were very personal to Chief Black Hawk, and he wanted these men dead. The final agreement, which was signed here in Chicken Creek Canyon on March 4th, 1854, brought an end to the Walker War, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about Chief Walker's role in it. And I say chief because by the end of the war he was a chief, but I don't believe that the man ever intended to be one. He was a spiritual advisor. All 6 of his brothers were chiefs, and he was content with leading his people. He'd had those visions, and he wanted to kind of bring them into a healthy relationship with the settlers. In fact, before the war was declared, he took up a role in leading Brigham Young and inviting them down to his territory so that the Mormons could settle amongst the Indians. But when the war started, all 6 of Walkara's brothers demanded retribution for the death of one of their relatives. And so they brought out Walkara, who was very well known as a leader because he was leading people along the old Spanish trail to, rustle 1,000 horses at a time and bring them back from Southern California. So they had him lead his people, and he didn't really want this role, so by the time they approached him for a peace deal here at Chicken Creek Canyon, he was very, very sad. In fact, he came up here, and all of the Mormon leadership, the church elders, including Porter Rockwell, Brigham Young, and other elders in the church, they came out and they wanted to kind of congratulate him as a worthy adversary. And the man who kind of tipped the scales here was Porter Rockwell. He brought out some whiskey which he'd brewed himself, and he gave it to Walkara, who took a hearty swig of it in his tent. Well, Walkara was deeply affected by this, and rather than become boastful and demand more gifts and presents, he was just sad. And they had to give him several hours before he could be roused from his tent, just staring at the ground, before he could come out and sign the treaty. And at the treaty signing, he tried to impress the Mormon leaders, because in the past he'd said, Brigham Young, Walkara's bigger than Young. I want to be like Brigham Young. So he wanted to seem impressive, so he took out a Bowie knife and he slashed the face of a friendly chief, someone who had arrived at negotiations as well. So after the Mormon elders had given him all these gifts in order to prevent an intertribal war, he basically had to turn over half of them to the chief which he'd wronged in this way. So it was a disaster for him personally, but it did result in a lasting peace. And after this, Brigham Young and elders of the church managed to go out and give Kanosh, Walkara's brother, and Walkara himself property along Corn Creek, and also reserved a reservation for them near Spanish Fork. And this was their ancestral homeland. The Mormons just finally cemented it as a place that would be controlled by their Indian agency. And it's a fascinating chapter of history, and I think that Walkara is greatly misunderstood. And it's there along the old Corn Creek that Walkara was buried only a few months after the war ended. I'm walking to the dried up Chicken Creek bed now where the treaty was signed, and so long as it would have been similar to other Indian treaties at the time signed in the local area, it would have had a stipulation saying that so long as the creek continues to flow, or that there is a creek bed, dry or not, then there will be peace between whites and the local Indians. And here we are now at the dry creek bed. Behind me and just outside of the town of Kanosh is a beautiful valley, the first valley that forms on the Corn Creek, which runs through this territory. We're in central Utah, and I'm trying to find the history of some of the Native American chiefs buried here. And behind me specifically is probably my most favorite Native American buried in all of the Great Basin, Chief Walkara. When Brigham Young and his party of Mormons entered into the Great Salt Lake and into the Great Plains, they discovered that it was ruled over by what Brigham Young called a royal family. And this family was headed by men like Walkara, Kanosh, and a number of other people such as Black Hawk. This is the Timpanogos tribe, and the Timpanogos tribe is often wrongly characterized as either Ute or Shoshone, but basically since the time of Munch, who was the grandfather of Chief Walkara, they had created a number of tribal people that had intermarried between the Shoshone and the Ute tribes, and also formed very good alliances with the Navajo to the far south and the Paiute all over this territory. So they had controlled essentially all of the Great Plains and the Great Basin through this intermarriage and diplomacy. And when you had the Mormons coming in, they started to form good relationships with them, because Walkara was influenced by Brigham Young. Brigham Young told them, "You're the lost tribe of Israel. You turned away from Christ at some point, but you can still be converted back and become white men. And once you become white men, through believing hard enough, we will treat you as equals." And he truly did believe this. And his brother oversaw, in the town right over here about a quarter mile, his brother oversaw the formation of a farm of the Paiute tribe, because again, Kanosh was a leader of a local band which had formed an alliance with the Timpanogos tribe. And eventually, Walkara, overseeing this, saw that his tribe was dying out. Their traditional lifestyle of hunting and gathering was dying. And he realized that he must declare war at some point against the white settlers, and that's exactly what he did. And this war consisted of him coming around the area down here and launching raiding parties. He's considered the Napoleon of the Great Plains. He was even called the Keeper of the Yellow Metal because he would often go around pillaging for gold. And it's said that in one raid alone in Southern California, keep in mind how far we are away from Southern California, he stole over 1,000 horses from a professional horse farm. And he gathered this sort of brutal reputation as being a warrior of the plains and a raider. And on his death in 1855, the Walker War ended, and he'd made an uneasy peace very shortly before his death with the Mormons. And this peace could not be broken. So when church officials oversaw the funeral, even though Walkara was a Mormon, the funeral was very brutal. They used 2 Native American children from the Pavant tribe, which was an enemy tribe, and they used a number of his wives, which they'd sacrificed. They killed some horses, and they buried him in a sacred cave along the valley behind me here. And I came here to find his grave, and the closest you can get to this valley is right next to his cemetery. And to my surprise, it being in the town of Kanosh, is buried his brother in a Christian burial, Chief Kanosh. And Chief Kanosh, as well, in a number of these wars out west, led the Navajo and the Paiute against the Mormons in the Black Hawk War a number of years later. But he again made peace and was not able to stop the advance of the white settlers, and eventually was buried as a Christian burial. But it's said that Walkara, after he died and the Mormon officials looked on in horror as these children were dying slowly in the cave with him, the Mormons knew where his grave was, and it was a sacred territory because this is all sacred land to the Timpanogos tribe. They raided his gravesite a number of years later, tried digging him up to steal his body because it was buried with a lot of armor and gold and guns and things that these settlers really wanted. And when they raided it, they found his skeleton mysteriously gone. And it's said that him being the Keeper of the Yellow Metal, a title bestowed only on the most noble people in the Ute tribe of the Wasatch Mountains, it's said that his brothers came a number of years later and brought him back up and buried him in a place called Kirushinab, which is the lost gold mine of the Ute Nation, a place where they store all of their treasures somewhere mysteriously up in the caves. And somewhere behind me is still the cave where the 2 children and the number of wives of Walkara are buried, in beautiful territory out here. And I can see why it's so sacred. You look at the mountains over here and it's a great basin, and you can see there's even a volcanic plug over there of black rock. And just looking around and seeing the beautiful grass flowing, the earth is sacred to these people. And I always used to go around looking for beautiful springs and rock formations, thinking maybe this spot is more sacred. But just breathing the air out here, it feels somewhat otherworldly. It's a different feeling entirely. And this is where Chief Walkara had his territory and where he died.